Hello everyone, this is Frenox. I'd like to share some of my thoughts regarding combat in Elite Dangerous. So here are the four main components of my sort of dream scenario for Elite Dangerous. The first one is for players to blend seamlessly into the world. The second one is for mode selection to be a matter of how much social interaction you want, not how much risk you want. The third thing is for a full spectrum of difficulty. And finally, number 4, I want emergent, dynamic, and unpredictable player-to-player interaction to be possible. Alright, so let's start with the first point, players blending seamlessly into the world. What do I mean by that? When I say players blending in, what I mean is that NPCs and players should be largely indistinguishable. The main difference between them, as far as I'm concerned, should only be who's behind the stick. Their builds, what sort of modules they use, what sort of activities they engage in, and their, I guess, general behavior should be as close as possible. The idea behind this is for players to feel like they are truly a resident of the game world. If you don't really blend in, it feels more like you are some sort of main character or superhero, which is fine, but that's more for like an RPG type game in my opinion. For this, I want to feel like I'm living in the world, going about my day-to-day business in space, instead of feeling like some kid playing with his toys in the toy box. Right now, this isn't really the case. Between differences in what build options we have available to us, and the way missions work and just the general pressures of the game, players and NPCs both drive very different ships, and behave in very different ways. So, how do we change this? The first and most straightforward thing to address would be the difference in builds. NPCs should be given access to all the same tools we have, and effort should be made to build said NPCs in similar ways to the way commanders build for the given activity. I acknowledge this would cause a lot of challenges with the way that engineering and shipbuilding in general works right now. That's okay. I don't want those things to stay the same, and when you're listening to this, please don't assume that I want these changes to be made in a vacuum. These aren't the only changes I want to be made, these are just kind of the key points. There are several other things that would need to change around them in order for it to work. The nice thing about NPCs having access to all the same tools and modules and builds and everything that commanders have access to is that everybody will get plenty of interaction with those tools, modules, and builds from both the giving side and the receiving side. What this does is unify the player base on any sort of balance changes that need to be made. Since everyone is faced with the same challenges and build pressures regardless of what sort of combat they prefer to engage in, informed and productive discussions can be had regarding how they should be balanced. Sure, not everyone will agree on every point, but that's just the nature of online discourse. The important thing is they'll all be working towards the same goal: balanced combat. Now, of course, combat's only one part of this point. There's another very important aspect to it, and that is the way NPCs and players behave. I don't just want players and NPCs to be built similarly, I want them to behave similarly. This means that if there are activities that NPCs are engaging in, there should probably be missions or other sorts of things that are causing players to behave in similar activities. Likewise, if there are things that players are doing, it would be interesting for NPCs to also be seen doing those same tasks. On a similar note, if players are engaging activities that don't really make sense in the game world, there should be pressures that encourage them not to do that. For example, consider the classic case of murder hoboing, that is, just interdicting some weaker ship and killing it for no particular reason, no personal gain, just for the fun of killing another ship. Now, this sort of activity makes some amount of sense. I mean, it is in human nature, apparently, to behave that way under certain circumstances. Where it doesn't make sense, though, is in something like a high security system. That sort of thing would presumably not happen in a high security system because it would be extremely difficult to perform that activity. NPCs having access to similar builds and tools that commanders have would help alleviate this a little bit, just by the nature of the cops being closer to players as far as their power is concerned. Even with that in mind, though, it's possible to interdict someone and kill them long before the cops arrive. In order to resolve that, what I would like to see is something like this. Imagine if, as soon as you began an illegal interdiction against someone, you would see messages popping up in your inbox from the cops indicating that they have noticed this and are on their way. As soon as the interdiction completes, whether the target submits or fails the interdiction, the cops would already be there, ready to go. Now, just interdicting someone isn't enough to give you a bounty, but as soon as either party fires an illegal shot, a significant cop force could already be present to make sure that it's very difficult for someone to commit an illegal murder. Another thing that would help would be to have a significant police force in Super Cruise already, so that if a commander is wanted, they won't be able to fly for very long without getting interdicted. The idea is to make it highly impractical for anyone to kill someone else in a high security system illegally, regardless of the ships that are involved. These protections could be scaled down as you go into lower security level systems to kind of give a little bit more meaning to that state. For instance, medium security systems could have the same forces that arrive as soon as an interdiction is complete, but have less of a supercruise presence to begin with. Low security might have the same protections as medium security, but the ships that arrive are a little bit less powerful. And finally, of course, Anarchy would have no protections whatsoever. If some sort of just psycho murder is going to be on the loose, Anarchy makes sense for where the place they'd be to do it. Now this is of course only one possible solution to one particular problem. I wanted to explain it though to give you an idea of the sort of thing I'm looking for. The idea is that if players are behaving in ways that don't make sense in the world, or are otherwise harmful to the world, adjust the mechanics to kind of guide their behavior to be more fitting. It's also important to make sure that the NPCs remain subject to all the same rules we are. For instance, it could be interesting to occasionally see some sort of crazy psycho murder NPC in a high security system getting just obliterated by the cops. It would help show players that while it is possible to potentially attack someone there, it is highly unlikely that you'll be able to succeed or even get out alive. Anyway, enough on that. I think you guys get the idea. Let's move on to the next point. Mode selection just being about how much social interaction you want, instead of how much risk you want. For this, let me start with an example. Imagine there's a hulling community goal going on right now. You're trying to decide how you want to fit your ship for it and which mode you want to play in. You like seeing all the other commanders around in open mode, especially during a community goal. You however also realize there's always going to be people there either looking to pirate or just kill for the fun of it. With that in mind, you realize you're going to have to give up lots of your cargo space in order to make your ship as defensible as possible. You may also feel pressured to fly a smaller, cheaper ship just in case things go belly up and you get destroyed. There's an alternative, however. You could fly in solo and private group, give up most of your defenses for maximum amount of cargo space, and enjoy the relative safety of only the NPCs to hassle you. Since the NPCs generally fail to present a credible threat to a competent pilot flying even a shieldless trade ship, giving up your defenses isn't so much a trade-off as it may seem initially. For this particular example, let's assume the commander's feeling social and wants the extra interaction with other commanders. Let's also assume this commander cares about the community goal and wants to be as successful at it as possible. Now here's the problem. The commander's faced with a choice. They have to either be efficient at the community goal, but give up the social interaction they want, or get the social interaction they want, but fail to be as successful at the community goal as they otherwise could have been. I don't particularly like this. I don't want any mode to feel excessively dangerous compared to the others, nor do I want any modes to feel excessively safe compared to the others. I want the modes to be equal, with the only difference being the amount of social interaction you want. After all, that's ultimately deciding, it's just the matchmaking. Do I want to be matched with no commanders, all commanders, or just a commander from a select group? The modes are called open, solo, and private group for a reason, not hard, medium, and easy. I'm not going to go into too much detail about specific changes that can be made to achieve this goal, since achieving the first goal of blending players into the world would cause this other one to kind of take care of itself. Ultimately, open will likely remain at least a little bit dangerous, just due to the fact that other commanders can potentially adapt and use creative strategies, that sort of thing. I realize that perfect parity isn't necessarily ever possible, but it should be what we're shooting for. Okay, so this next point is pretty straightforward, the difficulty spectrum. I would say that with the way the game is now, the bottom end of the spectrum is in a pretty good place. It's not super easy. When you're first starting out, things can be a little tricky, but it's also not overwhelmingly difficult. The problem is that we can hit the other end of the spectrum way too quickly. Once you get a decent feel for how to fly your ship, and once you've managed to acquire a decent ship, which is not terribly hard to do these days with all the credits coming as quickly as they do, combat can very quickly become somewhat trivial. Instead of having an interesting and exciting fight, it turns into how many elite anacondas can I farm over the course of an hour. I'm not particularly fond of what would be presumably one of the most dangerous NPCs being just a matter of fodder. Yes, said NPCs can potentially be dangerous for a relatively lightly defended trade ship, but that's part of another problem I'd like to get to later about combat specialization making too big of a difference in a single fight capability of a ship. What I would like to see is for the bottom end of the scale to stay roughly where it is now, but for the top end of the scale to be cranked up quite a bit. I want tangling with a top-end NPC flying a top-end ship to be quite challenging, even for a seasoned combat pilot flying a similarly top-end ship. I want the combat rank of an NPC to mean something, such that when you're looking at it, it plays a big factor into your decision of how you're going to approach the situation. To achieve this, some changes would likely need to be made as far as what sort of NPCs are sent after players in what situations. It might also be helpful to have some sort of mechanic that can potentially lower your combat rank, such that your combat rank eventually finds an equilibrium point that accurately reflects your capabilities at the time. I know that particular point would be extremely contentious, but it could also be that there's some hidden value in the background that takes care of that balancing, instead of your displayed Pilot Federation rank. Ultimately, the idea is to make sure that players remain challenged throughout their combat career, instead of quickly getting to a point where they somewhat stagnate. I want people to feel challenged no matter how long they've been playing the game, and I want people to always have something to aspire to. It's good for there to be situations that are too hard for you. It gives you something to shoot for. It drives progress. It gives you that feeling of progression and improvement as you hone your skills. There's nothing quite as exciting as finally being able to beat that situation that's giving you a hard time, and of course, being able to turn your sights towards the next most difficult thing. Alright, now this last point's a tough one. What do I mean by emergent, dynamic, and unpredictable player-to-player interaction? First off, let me clarify. I don't want this to just be about players fighting other players. Recall that in my earlier points, one of the big things I was focusing on was NPCs and players mirroring each other as much as possible. For the sake of simplicity, however, in this conversation I'm just going to be talking about players interacting with other players, so just keep in mind that I'm interested in all of these concepts carrying over into PvE as well. To illustrate what I'm talking about, I think it'd be easiest to start with an example. Let's take the classic case of a pirate interdicting a trade ship. If the pirate successfully interdicts the trader is faced with three possible decisions. Do I run? Do I capitulate to the pirate's demands and give them what they want? Or do I attempt to fight them off until the police arrive and possibly claim the bounty? I would argue that the option of fighting, and sometimes even the option of running, aren't realistic options right now because of a variety of reasons. The first and most immediately apparent reason is that of how shipbuilding works. Because so much of a ship's defense comes from which defensive internals and utilities they've equipped, you're faced with some weird choices when setting up your ship. You can either have modules to do your given task, so in this case the trader has his cargo racks, or you can have modules to try to help you make yourself stay alive, like hull reinforcement, module reinforcement, and shield cell banks. The choice of more health versus more cargo may seem like an interesting choice on the surface, but ultimately I'd argue that it's not a choice at all. If you're looking to trade, you need those cargo racks. That means your defenses are likely going to be compromised versus a ship specialized for combat, which means the whole stay and fight thing isn't a realistic option. I'm not a fan of this. I don't think you should have to give up defensive capabilities in order to be able to do whatever activity it is you're looking to do. Likewise, I don't think specializing in combat should give you an overwhelming advantage in health. Instead of this setup, I'd rather see combat specialization be more about utility and being able to stay out in the field longer than increasing your single fight performance and decreasing your risk. For example, being able to patch up your hull and modules between fights, being able to reload your weapons, having modules allowing you to be able to capture prisoners instead of just taking on bounties, things like the kill warrant scanner, things like wake scanners, all of those things would be adding utility and endurance without necessarily making a given fight any easier. A potential solution to this would be to move the various defensive modules into their own dedicated slots. The armor module on a ship could have a couple of slots in which you could fit either hull reinforcement packages or module reinforcement packages, and the shield generator could have a couple of slots in which you can either fit shield boosters or shield cell banks. You would of course still have the option to fit nothing in those slots if you are really keen on saving weight, but you would never feel forced to give up your defenses just to have your mission critical equipment. You'd still have a lot of options in how you wanted to set up your defense. Do you want to focus more on initial shield strength or recharge rate? Do you want to focus more on hull protection or module protection? But in general, the overall durability of your ship would be fairly consistent with other ships of the same class. This also gives Frontier a lot more control over how they balance a given ship. If they want a ship to have a lot of armor, they can give it very good base armor or several slots inside of its armor. If they want a ship to not have tons of armor, they can still give it loads and loads of internal module space without necessarily allowing it to put a hull reinforcement package in every single one of those and be a massive tank. Now here's another factor leading to lopsided and static player interactions: the balance between different ship sizes. The general setup I would like to see is as follows. The smaller ship is, the faster, more maneuverable, and cheaper it is, but is also less tolerant to mistakes, has less firepower, and has less utility. Bigger ships would be slower, less maneuverable, and more expensive than their smaller brethren, but have higher firepower, more utility, and generally be less punishing to mistakes. The idea here is that if you ever run into a situation of asymmetrical ship sizes in a fight, both parties have the option to disengage whenever they like. At any point, the smaller ship can run away and the bigger ship won't be able to catch up to it, and the bigger ship can simply low wake out of there and there's nothing the small ship can do to stop it. The best tool for killing a given ship would be a ship of a similar size. A lot of other changes would likely need to be made besides the ones I covered here. However, I think this is a valuable goal to be working towards. The single fight performance of various ships being both consistent and balanced amongst each other would lead to more interesting interactions, more varied interactions, and generally a more exciting game. Well, thanks for watching, thanks for sticking with me this whole time, and I hope you found this at least interesting or somewhat thought-provoking. I'd love to hear what you guys think about this dream version of Elite, and how your dream version may differ from it. Until next time, Commanders, have fun.